The sound of my name echoing through the loudspeaker at a Gannis arena should have been the proudest moment of my young life. I was 18 years old, valedictorian of my class at Boston Latin Academy, and ready to step into a future that finally belonged to me. As I walked across the polished wooden stage under the bright spotlights, I felt the weight of years of isolation and struggle fall from my shoulders. My classmates clapped. My teachers smiled, and even the dean leaned forward with a look of admiration as he handed me the medal for academic excellence. For a fleeting second, I let myself imagine that maybe, just maybe, my family might look at me with pride too. But then, everything shifted. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. David Mitchell, my 21-year-old stepbrother, shoving his way past rows of astonished parents in their pressed suits and floral dresses. He was not dressed for celebration. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair unkempt, his face twisted with an anger I recognized all too well. In the seconds it took him to storm up the side steps onto the stage, the cheers in the arena fell into confused murmurs. I opened my mouth to say something to plead with him to stop, but he was already in front of me. His hand flew toward my face. I felt the crack before I heard it. Pain exploded across my nose, hot and sharp, and the taste of iron filled my mouth as blood rushed down over my lips and onto the front of my graduation gown. My knees buckled under me, and the metal clattered to the floor. Gasps rose from the audience, sharp like broken glass. Somewhere, a mother covered her child's eyes. Teachers leapt from their seats, but for an eternal second, no one moved fast enough. David's voice sliced through the silence, carrying across the entire arena. Parasite. Family disgrace. The words hit me harder than his fist. And then he added a final slash of cruelty, pointing at me with venom dripping from every syllable. She is not even family. The words burned deeper than the blow itself. I had been called many things by him before in the safety of our home, where walls absorbed cruelty, but never here, not in front of hundreds of people. Not in front of my classmates and their parents who had once told me how bright my future looked. I pressed a hand against my nose, feeling the warm wetness soak into the white glove I had worn with such care that morning. Tears blurred my vision, but not enough to hide the sight of my stepfather Harold Mitchell standing just beyond the stage. He did not rush forward. He did not shout for David to stop. He stood there, arms folded across his expensive suit, watching with a detached expression as if the spectacle were nothing more than a business inconvenience. When a security guard hesitated at the edge of the stage, Harold's voice cut through cold and deliberate. "Let them sort it out. It is just family business." That sentence sealed my humiliation. He was not only refusing to protect me, he was sanctioning my public destruction. My legs gave out and I collapsed onto the stage floor. The cheers of celebration transformed into horrified whispers. My gown spread around me like a crimson-stained shroud. I heard someone calling for security, someone else screaming for a medic. The bright overhead lights seemed to grow hotter, pressing down on me until I thought I might suffocate. I remember staring at the medal glinting on the floor beside me, the symbol of all my years of hard work now lying in the shadow of my stepbrother's fury. I wanted to reach for it, but my body would not obey. A paramedic rushed to my side, voices swirled above me, and the arena became a blur of chaos. They lifted me onto a stretcher as the crowd parted, phones raised high to record the scene that would soon spill across social media for the world to consume. I caught one last glimpse of Harold. He did not look at me. His gaze followed David, who was shouting at the police officers, trying to drag him back, insisting that I had deserved it. I closed my eyes against the harsh arena lights and the jeers in my ears. In that suffocating darkness, a thought pierced through the pain with sharp clarity. This is not the end of my story. They can humiliate me, they can call me a parasite, they can try to erase me with words like not family, they can try to shatter me in public, but they will not define me. Hours later, after the blood had been cleaned from my face and the swelling had set in, I would learn something that made the humiliation of that moment almost surreal. The same stepbrother who broke my nose and screamed at me in front of hundreds of witnesses would soon crawl back into my life with desperation in his eyes. He would come begging me for $50,000. Before the blood and the humiliation of that graduation day, my story began in a small house in Worcester, Massachusetts, where the winters were long and the summers sticky and loud with neighborhood children playing in the cracked asphalt streets. I remember running through sprinklers and riding my bike until the streetlights flickered on my father waiting on the porch with a smile that felt like safety itself. He was a quiet man, steady and strong, the type who kept promises and made pancakes on Sundays. When he died suddenly of a heart attack when I was just 7, the foundation of my world crumbled in a way I did not yet understand. My mother, Linda, only in her early 30s, was devastated. For months, she floated through our home like a ghost, cooking dinners she barely touched, and folding laundry with eyes that seemed to look right through me. People in Worcester whispered that she needed someone to help her through the grief, and perhaps that is why when Harold Mitchell came into our lives, she let him in so quickly. Harold was everything my father had not been. Where my father was gentle, Harold was sharp. Where my father valued evenings at home, Harold valued power lunches and cocktail parties with men who spoke in numbers and contracts. He was a successful businessman in Boston, known for developing commercial properties and rubbing shoulders with city officials. To my mother, he must have seemed like stability, a chance to protect us both from sinking into despair. But to me, he was a stranger who moved into our house with cold eyes and an expensive watch who looked at me as though I were an obstacle rather than a child. He brought with him a son, David, 3 years older than me. At first, I thought having a stepbrother might mean company, someone to play with, but it took less than a week to understand the truth. David treated me like an intruder in his world. He would shove me when no one was looking, call me names that stung in ways I could not explain, and take whatever was mine, simply because he could. Harold never corrected him. If I complained, Harold would smile in a way that never reached his eyes and say, "Boys will be boys." My mother, desperate to keep peace, urged me to ignore it to be the bigger person. She would tell me David had lost his own mother young, that he was acting out from pain that I needed to understand. I was 7 years old, and already the burden of adult empathy was placed on my shoulders. As the years passed, the imbalance grew. Harold doted on David, praising his athletic attempts, his loud jokes, his reckless confidence. When David came home with mediocre grades, Harold brushed it off with laughter, claiming charm would take him further than books ever could. When I came home with straight A's, Harold barely looked up from his phone. Once, after I won first place in a Worcester elementary science fair, I showed Harold the ribbon with pride. He barely glanced at it before saying, "Your cousin Alicia probably has 10 of those." It was the first time I realized I would never be enough for him. Worcester began to feel like a place where I did not belong even in my own house. The comparisons became constant. Why cannot you be more like David? He makes friends easily. He has charisma. He is a leader. I heard it in whispered conversations between Harold and my mother late at night, in the way Harold boomed David's small victories to his colleagues while dismissing my academic milestones as luck. At 10 years old, I stopped bringing home my graded papers because the red A at the top only reminded me of the silence that would follow. Harold's control extended beyond affection. He restricted what I could do. When other children joined soccer or dance, he said we could not afford it, though I later learned he had paid for David's hockey equipment without hesitation. When I asked to attend a sleepover, he claimed the neighborhood was unsafe, but David stayed out until midnight with no questions asked. Slowly, my world shrank to school and home, a narrow corridor where I learned to survive quietly. The few times I resisted ended in punishment. Once, when I tried to hide in my room during one of David's rages, Harold pulled me out by the arm and scolded me for making family life difficult. "Your silence makes him worse," he told me, as if my mere existence was the cause of David's temper. My mother hovered nearby, wringing her hands, whispering enough "Harold, please," but she never stopped him. Each small betrayal chipped away at my trust until I began to build walls around my heart walls that kept me from collapsing under the weight of their disapproval. At 12, when most girls were giggling about crushes and planning birthday parties, I spent evenings in the public library. The Worcester Public Library became my sanctuary, a place where no one called me names or demanded that I be more like David. I buried myself in books about law and history, drawn to the idea of justice as though it could save me. I dreamed of courtrooms where truth mattered, where someone like me could stand tall and be heard. It was there that I met Mrs. Taylor, the school counselor, who noticed me hiding in the back corner with a stack of law books taller than my arms. She asked me about my dreams, and for the first time I spoke aloud the thought that had been circling in my head. I want to be a lawyer. I want to fight for what is right. Saying it out loud felt like lighting a match in the dark. Mrs. Taylor encouraged me, telling me that intelligence and persistence could open doors I never imagined. It was the first voice of belief I had heard in years, and I clung to it like oxygen. Meanwhile, back at home, David's cruelty grew bolder. He would spill juice on my homework, then laugh when I cried. He told classmates lies about me that spread through our schoolyard like wildfire. He shoved me against lockers when teachers were not watching, whispered insults so vile I repeated them in my head at night until sleep was impossible. And always, always, Harold defended him. Boys will be boys. Clara is too sensitive. Family comes first. Those words became a drumbeat in our household, drowning out my protests, suffocating me with their finality. By the time we moved to Boston when I was 14, I had already learned to keep my head down. Harold's business was thriving, then Mitchell Properties expanding into new neighborhoods with glossy advertisements that proclaimed integrity and trust. I watched the city applaud him as a success story, unaware that behind closed doors, he was turning a blind eye to the violence festering under his roof. Boston brought new schools, new faces, but the same old dynamics. David grew into a tall, broad-shouldered teenager who discovered alcohol and trouble faster than he discovered responsibility. Arrested for underage drinking in Cambridge, Harold smoothed it over with a phone call. Caught shoplifting in a mall. Harold dismissed it as boys being reckless. And when I begged my mother to intervene, she only said Harold knows best. The isolation was crushing, yet it planted in me a seed of quiet rebellion. I began documenting what happened. At first, it was scribbles in a notebook, then photographs of bruises hidden under sleeves, then journal entries timed to dates and events. I did not know what I would do with the evidence, but part of me believed that one day it might matter. That one day someone would listen. Looking back, I can see how those years in Worcester and Boston shaped me. They forged a girl who craved fairness, who memorized the faces of those who hurt her, and dreamed of standing tall in a place where their power could not reach. They gave me a front-row seat to hypocrisy, to a man celebrated in public who neglected in private, to a boy excused for cruelty while I was punished for endurance. Those contradictions hardened me into steel. By the time I was 16, I no longer hoped Harold would love me or that David would stop tormenting me. I only hoped for escape, for the day I could walk out the door and never return. That day would come, but not before the graduation stage became my battlefield, and the world finally saw the violence I had endured in silence for so long. By the time I entered my teenage years in Boston, I had already learned the language of silence. At Boston Latin Academy, one of the oldest and most demanding schools in the nation, I poured myself into work with a desperation that was less about ambition and more about survival. My grades were impeccable. My essays detailed my presentations, flawless. It was the only part of life I could control. In the classroom, I was not Harold's stepdaughter or David's punching bag. I was Clara Mitchell, a name teachers respected as student. Classmates grudgingly admired. But the moment I stepped through the doors of our townhouse near Back Bay, the air thickened with hostility. David had grown taller, stronger, and crueler. At 17, he carried himself with swagger, bragging about parties in Cambridge and friends who never seemed to last long. To him, I was still the shadow in his way. His insults grew sharper. Leech, dead weight, a parasite who lived off Harold's money. Never mind that Harold rarely spent a cent on me while paying for David's hockey gear, new sneakers, and weekend trips. Whenever I tried to point out the unfairness, Harold's hand would slice through the air, silencing me. "Enough, Clara! You exaggerate. David is a boy who needs room to grow. You are the one who should learn discipline." The words cut deeper than any bruise. Once, after I stayed late at school to finish a debate practice, I came home to find David waiting in the kitchen. He accused me of lying about where I had been, of sneaking around with boys, of trying to embarrass him with my so-called perfect act. When I tried to walk past him, he shoved me against the refrigerator so hard that the magnets clattered to the floor. My breath left my lungs in a gasp, but before I could call out, Harold walked in. For a heartbeat, I thought he would finally see the truth. Instead, he looked at me with disgust. "Stop provoking your brother. Do not make me regret taking you into this family." My chest ached not from the shove, but from the knowledge that the man who should have protected me had decided I was the problem. My mother Linda stood behind him, eyes wet, whispering, "Harold, please." But he ignored her. That night, I sat at my desk with a pounding chest and opened a new notebook. On the first page, I wrote the date, the time, and exactly what had happened. I underlined the words refrigerator incident 3 times. I told myself if no one would defend me, then I would defend myself with evidence. That notebook became my silent companion, page after page filled with records of David's violence and Harold's complicity. A bruise on my arm on October 12th, a shove in the hallway on November 2nd, Harold telling me I was too sensitive on November 3rd. I did not know what I would do with it, but the act of writing was a form of resistance proof that I was not imagining it, that my suffering was real. Outside the house, my life looked bright. Teachers praised my essays on constitutional law, friends like Sophie Miller cheered me on at debate competitions. But inside nights were filled with muffled arguments and the sound of David slamming doors. He dropped out of school during his junior year, claiming teachers hated him. Harold shook his head, but paid for a lawyer when David was caught driving under the influence near Cambridge. It was his first arrest, but not his last. Harold told business associates it was a misunderstanding, a rite of passage for young men. At home, he lectured me about responsibility as if I were the one behind the wheel. The hypocrisy was suffocating. The imbalance became clearer with each passing year. When I asked to join an extracurricular club, Harold said we could not afford it. When David asked for money for a weekend trip, Harold handed him cash without blinking. When my sneakers had holes, Harold told me to budget better. When David wanted a new car stereo, Harold co-signed a loan. The message was relentless. David was worthy of investment. I was worthy only of restraint. Still, I held on to my dream. Every night, I studied with the determination of someone running toward a finish line no one else could see. I whispered to myself that one day I would leave this house and never look back. At 15, I won first place in a statewide essay contest on civil rights. The prize was a scholarship to a summer program in Washington, D.C. I came home bursting with excitement, holding the acceptance letter like a golden ticket. Harold skimmed it and shrugged. "Waste of time. You should be helping around the house, not chasing silly dreams." That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, clutching the letter and promising myself that I would go anyway. And I did. I scraped together money from tutoring younger students borrowed from Sophie's family and boarded that bus to Washington. For 2 weeks, I breathed air free from Harold's control, surrounded by young people who believed in law and justice as much as I did. It felt like a glimpse of the life I wanted. Returning home was like stepping back into a cage. David had grown more volatile. He drank heavily, came home late, picked fights over nothing. One evening, he cornered me in the living room, sneering that I thought I was better than everyone, that my trophies and ribbons meant nothing. He shoved me onto the couch, my head snapping against the armrest. My mother rushed in, horrified, but Harold pulled her back. "Do not interfere," she provoked him. Those words seared into my memory. Even pain became my fault. After that, I doubled down on documenting everything. I took photographs of bruises, hid them on a flash drive, wrote detailed entries timed to exact hours. It was my secret rebellion, my shield against the erasure Harold tried to impose. I began to imagine a future courtroom where the truth would finally be spoken, where David's smirk would vanish under the weight of evidence, where Harold's indifference would be exposed as neglect. Until then, I endured building a fortress out of grades and ambition. On the surface, I was the perfect student. Underneath, I was a girl counting the days until freedom. These teenage years carved me into steel, not because I wanted to be strong, but because weakness was not an option. Every shove, every insult, every dismissal became fuel for a fire I could not yet release. And though I did not know it then, that fire would one day explode under the bright lights of a graduation stage, and the world would finally see the violence I had carried in silence. By the time senior year arrived, I had built my life around small victories that no one at home cared to notice. I spent hours buried in books at Boston Latin Academy, preparing for exams, rehearsing for debate competitions, polishing essays until my fingers cramped. Each success outside the house was a reminder that the cage Harold and David tried to keep me in could not hold me forever. Yet I still carried the weight of fear each night, bracing for the next eruption. The balance began to shift one chilly November afternoon when I opened a letter that changed everything. It had the seal of Boston University printed in bold crimson. My hands trembled as I tore it open in the school hallway, surrounded by chatter and slamming lockers. The words swam before my eyes. "Congratulations, Clara Mitchell. You have been accepted into Boston University with a partial scholarship in the pre-law track." My knees nearly buckled. For years, I had whispered my dream to myself in secret, afraid that saying it out loud would invite Harold's contempt. Now it was real. I clutched the letter to my chest, tears burning my eyes, and for once they were not tears of pain. Sophie Miller, my best friend since 9th grade, snatched the letter from my shaking hands and squealed so loudly that half the hallway turned to stare. She hugged me until I could barely breathe. "You did it, Clara. You are going to be free." Her words filled me with a hope I had never dared to feel. That night I showed my mother. Linda's eyes softened as she read, her lips trembling with something like pride. But Harold only frowned. "A waste of time and money. Law is an oversaturated field. You should study business and come work for me." He tossed the letter onto the table as though it were a grocery receipt. My chest tightened, but I refused to let him steal this moment. I picked up the letter and tucked it into my binder, vowing to guard it like the treasure it was. For days afterward, I lived in the glow of that acceptance. At school, teachers congratulated me. Mrs. Taylor pulled me aside and said, "I knew you would do it, Clara. Your intelligence and determination will take you far." Her faith in me steadied my shaking resolve. In quiet moments, I allowed myself to imagine walking across a college campus in Boston, books tucked under my arm, no longer confined by Harold's shadow. It was the first real glimpse of a life where I was defined not by their cruelty, but by my own effort. Sophie became my anchor in those months. She would sit with me late into the night, planning what dorm life might be like, laughing about classes we might sneak into together, even though she planned to attend UMass Amherst. Sometimes she looked at me with an intensity that made my throat tighten. "You know you are not alone anymore, right? I am your family, too." Those words wrapped around me like a blanket I had craved since childhood. For once, I believed it. There were other sparks of light, too. A history teacher who asked me to mentor younger students. A debate competition where I argued a constitutional case and won with thunderous applause. Each victory was a thread in a rope pulling me toward freedom. But light attracts shadow, and at home, the tension grew. David mocked me, relentlessly sneering about my acceptance letter, saying no one needed another boring lawyer. Harold piled on, warning that scholarships never covered enough and that I would drown in debt. Their scorn should have crushed me, but instead it fueled me. Each insult became another reason to succeed. I doubled down on my documentation, keeping track not only of the violence but of their dismissals of my dreams. Deep down, I knew that someday these records might matter. One evening, Mrs. Taylor invited me to her office after school. She placed a small box of books on the table, titles about law, justice, and resilience. "I want you to have these, Clara. You are going to need them. But more than that, you need to remember that your worth is not determined by Harold or David. It is yours alone." Her voice cracked slightly, and I saw tears glistening in her eyes. It was the closest thing to parental pride I had felt since my father's death. That night, I sat in bed reading by lamplight, the house silent around me, and whispered to myself, "I will get out. I will make this dream real." Hope had taken root not as a fragile seedling, but as a growing tree, and I clung to it fiercely. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe in a future where I was not just surviving, but thriving. The darkness at home did not vanish, but it no longer swallowed me whole. I had something they could not take away, a path forward, a future waiting. And as I looked toward the spring graduation ceremony, I carried both dread and anticipation, not knowing that the stage would become the place where everything I had hidden would explode into the open for the world to see. Graduation day arrived with the kind of bright June sunlight that makes the city of Boston look almost forgiving. I woke early, my stomach fluttering with nerves, my hands carefully smoothing the wrinkles out of the deep maroon gown and cap that had been hanging in my closet for weeks. The gown was heavier than I expected when I slipped it on its fabric, rustling like a secret I had been carrying for years. My mother, Linda, stood in the doorway of my room, tears in her eyes, whispering, "You look beautiful, Clara." For a fleeting second, I wanted to believe that this day would wash away the years of silence and bruises. Aganis Arena was already buzzing when we arrived, the crowd of families filling the seats, cameras flashing flowers clutched in nervous hands. Boston Latin Academy had chosen this place for its grandeur, a space large enough to hold the weight of history. My classmates clustered together, laughter bubbling over as they adjusted caps and gowns. I smiled but kept to the edges, the old habit of shrinking myself too deeply ingrained. When the procession began and our names were called one by one, my chest swelled with something close to pride. I thought of the library nights, the debate competitions, the tears shed in secret. This was my moment earned through years of clawing my way toward the light. The arena's energy surged when the dean announced the valedictorian. My name echoed through the speakers. Clara Mitchell. The applause that followed was thunderous, washing over me in a tide I had never felt before. I walked across the polished stage, my heart hammering, my eyes scanning the crowd. For the first time in years, I felt seen. The dean smiled warmly as he handed me the medal, his words of praise lost in the roar of clapping hands. And then, everything fractured. David Mitchell, my 21-year-old stepbrother, pushed his way through the audience with the fury of a storm. Gasps rippled as he stormed up the stairs onto the stage, his shirt wrinkled, his face contorted in rage. I froze, the medal slipping in my grasp. In the blink of an eye, his fist collided with my face. The crack echoed through the microphone. White-hot pain exploded across my nose. Blood poured down onto my gown. The crowd gasped in unison, the sound of hundreds of people inhaling horror all at once. Teachers leapt to their feet. Parents covered their children's eyes. My body buckled the floor, rushing up to meet me. I saw the medal spin across the stage, glittering under the lights before clattering to a stop. David's voice roared above the chaos, amplified by the microphone he had nearly knocked over. "Parasite! Family disgrace! She is not even family!" Each word was a blade slicing deeper than the fist had. He pointed at me bloodied and stunned, his words carrying to the farthest row of the arena. The humiliation seared itself into my bones. Through blurred vision, I searched for Harold. He stood at the edge of the stage, arms crossed over his immaculate suit. His eyes were cold, his lips pressed thin. When a security guard stepped forward, Harold raised a hand and muttered, "Let them sort it out. It is just family business." That sentence burned hotter than the blood on my face. In that moment, I realized he would never see me as his daughter, only as an inconvenience. My knees hit the stage hard. My gown spread around me like a dark red banner. Someone screamed for medics. Someone else shouted, "Call the police." Phones shot up in the crowd, recording broadcasting my destruction to the world. The paramedics rushed in their hands, lifting me, voices sharp and urgent. "Stay with us. Keep your eyes open." The lights above blurred into a cruel halo. My last sight before being carried away was David thrashing in the grip of two officers, shouting, "She deserved it. She provoked me." The words were venom, but this time hundreds had heard them. This time there were witnesses. At Massachusetts General Hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic filled my senses as doctors worked to stop the bleeding and confirm the fracture. My body throbbed with pain, but inside me something fierce was rising. Sophie appeared at my bedside, her face streaked with tears and fury. Mrs. Taylor stood behind, her eyes blazing. They were proof that not everyone had abandoned me. As I lay there with bandages across my face, a clarity formed in my mind. This was not just another private wound to bury. This was public, undeniable, recorded and witnessed. For years, I had carried notebooks filled with hidden evidence. Now the world had seen for themselves. My humiliation was raw, unbearable, but it carried within it the seed of something powerful. I was no longer invisible. The city had watched me fall. Now they would watch me rise. That night, as I lay in the hospital bed scrolling through Sophie's phone, I saw the videos already spreading across TikTok and Facebook. Parasite girl. Stepbrother breaks her nose at graduation. Comments poured in. Shock. Anger. Demands for justice. For the first time in my life, the cruelty was not a private secret. It was a story the world would not ignore. And though my nose ached with every breath, though humiliation still burned through me, I felt something stirring, a promise to myself that this was not the end. It was only the beginning. The sterile white walls of Massachusetts General Hospital became both a prison and a sanctuary in the days after the graduation attack. I lay in bed with bandages wrapped around my nose, my body aching, the bright June sunlight filtering through blinds that cast bars of light across the sheets. Each morning I woke with the sting of pain and the sharper sting of memory. The sound of the crack, the roar of David's voice calling me Parasite, the sight of Harold folding his arms and muttering, "Let them sort it out," as though my destruction were nothing but family inconvenience. Those images looped endlessly, but alongside them was something new, the knowledge that this time the world had seen. On the second morning, Sophie appeared at my bedside holding her phone like a weapon. "Clara, it is everywhere!" She thrust the screen toward me. I saw my own face bloodied and stunned, splashed across TikTok, across Facebook, across news sites with headlines screaming, "Stepbrother assaults valedictorian at graduation." There were thousands of comments. Some expressed shock, others rage. Hashtags bloomed like wildfire. Justice for Clara, protect victims, family violence, exposed. For the first time, my suffering was not hidden behind closed doors. It was out in the open, and that terrified Harold. By the afternoon, he appeared in my hospital room, his expensive suit crisp, his voice icy. "Clara, we need to talk." I turned my face toward the window, refusing to meet his gaze. He continued, his tone sharp with authority. "This has gone far enough. We can handle this quietly, keep it in the family." I closed my eyes and said nothing. Sophie stood beside my bed like a guard dog, her arms crossed. Harold's nostrils flared. "Think about your mother, Clara. Do not make this worse than it is." Then he left the click of his shoes echoing down the sterile corridor. My mother Linda slipped in minutes later, eyes swollen from crying. She reached for my hand, but her voice was weak. "Please, do not fight Harold. It will only make life harder." I pulled my hand back gently. For years, I had listened to her pleas for silence. This time would be different. That evening, Mrs. Taylor visited. She pulled a chair close to my bed, her eyes full of fire. "Clara, you have proof. You have the video, the witnesses, your notebooks. This is your chance." My throat tightened as I whispered, "But Harold controls everything." Mrs. Taylor shook her head. "Not this time. This is too public, too loud. He cannot bury it." She placed a business card on the table beside my bed. "Ethan Ross, young attorney. Smart. He helps victims pro bono. Call him." That night, I stared at the card until the letters blurred. Ethan Ross. It felt like a door creaking open. The next morning, Sophie dialed the number before I could change my mind. Ethan arrived within hours, a tall man in his late 20s with sharp eyes softened by compassion. He listened quietly as I recounted everything, his pen scratching across a legal pad. When I showed him my notebook filled with years of entries, the photos, the flash drive of recordings, his jaw tightened. "Clara, this is not just one assault. This is a pattern. We can press charges against David and build a case that shines light on Harold's role in covering it up." I felt my stomach twist. I had imagined this moment for years, but now that it was here, the weight of it crushed me. Harold's fury would be unimaginable. David's violence would escalate. Could I survive it? Ethan seemed to read my hesitation. "Clara, I will stand with you. Sophie and Mrs. Taylor, too. You are not alone anymore." Those words cracked the shell of fear I had been living in. I nodded slowly, my hands trembling. "Do it. File the charges." The next days blurred into a storm of paperwork and statements. Boston PD detectives visited my room, reviewing the viral video recording my account. My hands shook, but my voice stayed steady. For the first time, I felt like my words mattered. Ethan coached me through the legal process, explaining how assault charges worked, how evidence would be presented. He told me we could also pursue civil damages for the injury. When I asked why, he leaned forward. Because people like Harold and David only understand consequences when they feel them in their wallets and reputations. Each conversation lit a fire in me. I began to imagine not just survival, but justice. At night in the hospital, when the ward grew quiet and the machines hummed softly, I replayed Harold's cold words in my head. Let them sort it out. It is just family business. Those sentences no longer silenced me. They fueled me. If he thought family business meant erasing me, he would learn that family business could also mean his empire unraveling. Within a week, I was discharged my nose tender but healing. Sophie and her parents offered me their guest room in Cambridge. I accepted without hesitation. The townhouse in Back Bay was no longer a home. Living under Sophie's roof, I felt something I had not felt in years: safety. The first night I slept without jerking awake at every sound. In the morning, I sat at the kitchen table sipping coffee as Sophie's mother asked about my classes and Sophie's father folded the newspaper. It was ordinary and it was everything. From there, my recovery became both physical and strategic. I attended doctor appointments, endured the ache of healing bones, and in the evenings, I met with Ethan and Mrs. Taylor to plan the case. We spread my notebooks across the table, highlighting entries, cross-referencing dates with school records, pulling together a timeline so damning it made my stomach churn. Ethan's eyes hardened with each detail. Clara, this is not just a defense. This is an indictment of years of abuse, and we will make sure it is heard. The Boston Globe published the first story a week later. Valedictorian assaulted by stepbrother at graduation. Inside, the journalist included witness accounts, clips from the viral video, and a reference to whispers of previous incidents. The article ended with a chilling line: sources suggest potential complicity by stepfather Harold Mitchell, a Boston real estate developer. Reading it, my hands shook. My story was no longer a secret. It was on the front page. Harold called my phone that night. I let it ring. He sent texts. "Stop this now. You are ruining us. You will regret this." I turned the phone off. For once, his threats did not control me. The city was watching, the law was moving, and I was not alone. The next day, Ethan looked me in the eye and said, "Clara, are you ready for this to become public in court?" I swallowed hard. Yes. More ready than I have ever been. In that moment, I felt the shift inside me, the transformation from victim to fighter. I had been forced into silence for too long. Now I would use my voice, and the world would listen. The day of the hearing at Suffolk County Court arrived with a tension so thick it pressed against my skin. I had dressed carefully in a simple navy dress, my nose still slightly swollen, but healed enough that I could walk with my head held high. Sophie clutched my hand as we approached the courthouse, her grip steady, her eyes fierce. Outside the building, a crowd had gathered. News vans lined the curb, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky, cameras already rolling. Reporters shouted questions as we passed. "Clara, how do you feel facing your stepbrother? Do you believe justice will be served?" Their words swirled around me, but I kept walking, my pulse pounding in my ears. For once, it was not shame driving my steps, but determination. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with anticipation. David sat at the defense table, his jaw clenched, his posture defiant. Harold sat behind him, his suit impeccable, his expression unreadable. He looked at me once, his gaze cold, and then shifted his attention to the lawyers, as if I were nothing but a nuisance. I took my seat beside Ethan Ross. He placed a hand briefly on my shoulder. "You are not alone. Remember that." The judge entered, and the room rose. As the proceedings began, Ethan stood and presented the viral video. The sound of David's fist connecting with my face echoed through the speakers, followed by his voice, roaring, "Parasite family disgrace. She is not even family." Gasps rippled through the audience. Some covered their mouths. Others shook their heads in disbelief. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to watch, to relive the moment I had once thought would break me. Instead, it strengthened me. Ethan followed the video with my notebooks, page after page of meticulous entries. Photographs of bruises, Dates aligned with school records. Witness accounts from teachers who had noticed injuries I had tried to hide. Sophie testified, her voice trembling with emotion as she described nights she had held me after David's assaults, mornings she had covered for me when I was too bruised to face classmates. Mrs. Taylor spoke to, her words sharp, as she told the court she had urged intervention years before, but had been dismissed by Harold. Each testimony built a wall of truth around me. David shifted in his seat, his bravado cracking. He muttered under his breath, rolled his eyes, but the weight of evidence pressed him down. The prosecution laid out the case with clarity. This was not an isolated incident, but a pattern of abuse protected and enabled by silence. When it was my turn to speak, my legs trembled as I rose, but my voice was steady. I told the court about Worcester, about Boston, about years of being called a parasite, a leech, about the shoves against refrigerators, the bruises hidden under sleeves, the nights spent writing it all down because I feared no one would ever believe me. I told them how Harold had folded his arms while I bled on stage, how his words, "let them sort it out," had branded themselves into my soul. By the time I finished, the courtroom was silent. Even the judge leaned forward, eyes narrowed with something like empathy. The verdict came swiftly. David was sentenced to probation and community service, ordered to attend anger management, and required to pay me $50,000 in damages. It was not prison, but it was accountability, and the monetary compensation carried a symbolic weight. For years he had taken from me, now he was forced to give. As the gavel struck, I felt a surge of triumph. But the story did not end there. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as Ethan spoke to the press. This is not just about one assault. This is about a culture of silence around family violence. Clara Mitchell has shown courage in breaking that silence. His words spread across evening news segments, across social media feeds. The city rallied. Hashtags trended again, louder this time. People began to ask questions not only about David, but about Harold. Why had a successful businessman allowed this to continue? What role had he played in shielding his son? Within days, the Boston Globe published an exposé. They revealed leaked emails between Harold and attorneys instructing them to bury David's prior DUI arrests, to intimidate witnesses, to keep incidents off the record. One email read, clearly, "Keep this quiet, family reputation depends on it." The article quoted an anonymous whistleblower from Mitchell Properties who claimed Harold had used company funds to pay for legal settlements tied to David's behavior. The story ignited outrage. Within a week, the Attorney General of Massachusetts announced an official investigation into Harold Mitchell for obstruction of justice and misuse of corporate resources. At a press conference, cameras captured the Attorney General declaring no one is above accountability, not even those who hide behind family or fortune. Standing at Sophie's side watching the broadcast, I felt a tremor of vindication. The man who had once told me I was nothing was now facing the weight of the law. The fallout was immediate. Investors began pulling out of Mitchell Properties. Banks withdrew lines of credit. Community organizations canceled partnerships. The Boston Real Estate Association revoked Harold's membership. Headlines screamed Mitchell Properties in free fall. Once hailed as a titan of development, Harold was now a symbol of corruption and complicity. Reporters swarmed his office. Shareholders demanded answers. Contracts dissolved overnight. Within months, the company filed for bankruptcy protection. Harold's name, once spoken with deference in City Hall, became shorthand for scandal. Watching it unfold, I felt no pity. This was the consequence of years of silence and cruelty. This was justice unfolding not just in a courtroom but in the community. Yet the emotional waves were complex. My mother, Linda, wept quietly at night, torn between loyalty to her husband and love for her daughter. She finally began therapy urged on by Mrs. Taylor and slowly admitted the years of fear that had kept her frozen. I held her hand during one session as she whispered, "I should have protected you." It was the closest thing to an apology I had ever heard. The city watched each development with hungry eyes. Talk shows debated the case. Students at Boston Latin Academy wore ribbons in solidarity. Strangers approached me on the street to whisper thank you for speaking out. Their voices reminded me that this was bigger than me. It was about every person silenced in their own home, every victim told to stay quiet for the sake of family reputation. My revenge was not just personal, it was public. It was watching Harold's empire collapse under the weight of truth. It was watching David scrub graffiti off city walls as part of his community service, while cameras recorded his humiliation. It was reclaiming the power stolen from me. The high point came when the Attorney General held a second press conference. Reporters filled the room, cameras whirring. Documents were displayed showing Harold's signature on settlements, his directives to intimidate witnesses, his complicity laid bare. The Attorney General's voice rang clear. Harold Mitchell used his wealth and influence to conceal violence within his family and to obstruct justice in this state. He will face the consequences. The footage aired that night played on repeat across Boston's news networks. Harold's face, once smug and untouchable, was now pale and cornered. I watched it from Sophie's couch, a cup of tea warming my hands, and for the first time in years I allowed myself to smile without reservation. Revenge had come not through fists or fury, but through exposure, through truth shouted louder than Harold's silence. It was not the kind of revenge that ended in blood, but in humiliation, accountability, collapse. And it was sweeter for that. In the quiet afterward, I sat by my window staring out at the Cambridge skyline and felt the weight lift from my chest. The girl who once scribbled bruises into notebooks had stood in court, faced her abuser, and brought down a man who thought himself untouchable. The journey was far from over, but in that moment I knew one thing with certainty. They had tried to erase me. Instead, I had erased their power. The months following the collapse of Mitchell Properties were a strange mixture of relief and unease. My days settled into a rhythm of preparation for Boston University, volunteering part-time at a women's shelter and slowly helping my mother through therapy sessions as she tried to disentangle herself emotionally from Harold. The noise of the media storm had begun to quiet, but its aftershocks lingered. Whenever I walked across Cambridge or Boston, people still recognized me. Some offered quiet nods of respect, others whispered about the story they had seen on television or online. It was humbling, but also exhausting, carrying the weight of a narrative larger than myself. I thought I had seen the last of David after the court ruling, after the headlines of his probation and restitution. But humiliation has a way of echoing, and his humiliation was just beginning. One humid evening in late July, I was in my small Cambridge apartment unpacking textbooks for my upcoming pre-law program when a sharp knock rattled the door. Sophie, who was staying over that night, froze mid-sentence as we studied. "Do not open it," she whispered, but curiosity tugged at me. I pulled the door open cautiously, and there he was, David Mitchell. My stepbrother. The boy-turned-man who had broken my nose in front of hundreds now stood on my doorstep. His appearance shocked me. Gone was the cocky grin, the swagger, the expensive sneakers Harold had once bought him. He looked gaunt, his cheeks hollow, his clothes wrinkled and stained. His eyes darted around the hallway like a trapped animal. "Clara," he croaked, his voice hoarse. "I need your help." Sophie jumped to her feet, anger flashing across her face. "You have no right to be here. Leave!" But David dropped to his knees in the doorway before either of us could move. "Please," he begged, his hands trembling. "I need $50,000. If I do not get it, I am finished." I blinked in disbelief. $50,000, the exact sum the court had ordered him to pay me only months earlier. The irony struck like thunder. "You already gave me $50,000, I said coldly. "By court order. You broke my nose and now you think you can beg me for mercy." His eyes filled with desperate tears. "I cannot survive, Clara. Everyone has turned their back on me. Dad is drowning in lawsuits. No one will hire me. The banks closed my accounts. I have nothing. I need this money. Please." Sophie stepped closer, fury radiating from her. "You think she owes you after everything? After what you did in front of the entire city?" David clutched at my ankle like a drowning man grasping for a rope. "I am begging you, Clara. You are my only chance." My chest tightened. Once, long ago, I might have felt pity, but the image of him on that stage, shouting Parasite as blood ran down my gown, flared in my mind. I yanked my foot back and stared down at him. "You called me a parasite, David. You humiliated me in front of everyone I knew. And now you are on your knees asking the same Parasite for $50,000. Sophie pulled out her phone recording silently. Neighbors opened their doors at the sound of David's pleading. Within moments, half the hallway had gathered, watching the scene unfold. The predator had become the spectacle. "Clara, please!" he sobbed. His forehead pressed to the floor. "I cannot breathe. I cannot think. I am drowning. Just 50,000. One more chance." I swallowed hard, fighting the wave of old guilt that always rose around family. But then I remembered the bruises, the years of silence, the folded arms of Harold as I bled. I steadied my voice. "David, I said the court already gave me 50,000. From you. That is all you will ever give me." His face crumpled as if I had struck him. The crowd murmured phones, raised cameras capturing every desperate motion. David wept openly now, sobs racking his body. He begged again and again, the words slurred with snot and tears. 50,000, Clara. "I will do anything, please." But I turned away, my back straight. Sophie guided me inside and shut the door, leaving him collapsed in the hallway. For long minutes we listened to his sobs fade, then footsteps retreating. By the next morning, the video Sophie had taken was everywhere. Uploaded to social media, shared across platforms, the clip spread like wildfire. Headlines blared. Stepbrother who broke sister's nose begs her for $50,000. The irony was too delicious for the public to ignore. News anchors replayed the footage with disbelief. Commentators shook their heads. Online forums erupted in laughter and condemnation. The man who had once been shielded by wealth and influence was now reduced to a viral cautionary tale. Even late-night comedians made jokes about him, calling him the parasite who begged the parasite. David became a meme, his tear-streaked face pasted onto GIFs captions mocking his downfall. His humiliation was global now, not just local. Strangers from California to London commented on his desperation. Hashtags trended again this time, not just "had justice for Clara," but #beggingbrother and #karma at the door. I sat with Sophie watching the avalanche unfold. My stomach twisted with conflicting emotions. Part of me relished the justice, the reversal of power. Another part felt the sting of pity, seeing a man broken down to scraps of dignity. But pity could not erase years of torment, nor could it repair the bone he had shattered or the childhood Harold had poisoned. This was consequence, not cruelty. A week later, I received a letter from David, scrawled and messy, slipped under my door. It begged again for money, claimed he would disappear if I helped. I tore it in half without replying. Some lines cannot be crossed back. For too long, I had been the silent one, the forgiving one. Now I was the judge of my own life. The public humiliation sealed his fate far more effectively than any courtroom verdict could. Employers who might have considered him now laughed at his name. Landlords refused applications. Old friends avoided him. The boy who once strutted through Cambridge like he owned it was now a ghost wandering the city's edges. That was the final twist, the poetic balance of justice. He had called me a parasite, but ended up feeding off the scraps of sympathy from strangers, none of whom would extend a hand. He had tried to crush me in public, and in public he was crushed. My revenge had never been plotted with malice. It had been born from truth exposed. But watching David beg on his knees, watching the world mock the very arrogance that once destroyed me, I knew something deeper. Justice is not always about prison or fines. Sometimes it is about stripping away the mask of power and forcing someone to face themselves. And David, kneeling on my doorstep, had faced himself at last. The morning after the video of David begging for money went viral, I woke up to hundreds of notifications on my phone. Messages from strangers, classmates, professors, even people I had not spoken to since elementary school flooded my inbox. Some wrote words of encouragement, some confessed they had experienced something similar. Others simply sent a single word, justice. As I scrolled, a strange calm settled over me. For so long I had carried the burden of shame, but now the shame was no longer mine. It belonged to David, to Harold, to those who had stood by in silence. Sophie brewed coffee in the kitchen, humming softly, and slid a mug toward me. "You know this clip is everywhere," she said. "Even my cousin in California texted me about it." I nodded. Let it be everywhere. For once, I was not afraid of being seen. The humiliation had shifted sides. Instead of shrinking under their cruelty, I was rising in the light of truth. Yet, amid the vindication, a deeper question stirred inside me. What would I do with the $50,000 the court had ordered David to pay me? The check had arrived weeks before crisp and official, but I had left it untouched in a drawer. The money was tainted, a product of violence and restitution, and I could not bring myself to spend it on textbooks or rent. One evening, Sophie found me staring at the envelope. What if I said quietly, I gave it away? To who? To people who have lived through what I have lived through, to women in shelters, to girls who are told their voices do not matter. Sophie studied me for a long moment. That would turn pain into purpose, she said finally, and you would never regret it. The next day, I walked into the Boston Women's Shelter, the same place where I had volunteered part-time and asked to speak to the director. When I placed the check on her desk, her eyes widened. Are you sure, Clara? That money is yours. I am sure, I replied. I want it to be theirs now. Word spread quickly. Local news outlets picked up the story. Headlines read, Judge's stepdaughter donates court restitution to women's shelter. The narrative shifted again. I was no longer only the girl with the broken nose. I was someone who had taken pain and reshaped it into something that might help others survive. The shelter launched new programs with the funds. Beds were added, counseling, expanded job training offered. I visited often, meeting women whose stories mirrored mine in haunting ways. One woman told me she had left her partner the night she saw my story on the news. Another said the donation had given her daughter her first real bed in months. Their gratitude was humbling, but more than that, it healed me in ways I had not expected. My mother, Linda, began attending therapy regularly, encouraged by the collapse of Harold's empire and by my insistence that she deserved to reclaim her life. For years, she had been Harold's shadow, apologizing for him smoothing over his temper, shrinking herself to survive. Now she sat across from me in a therapist's office, her hands trembling as she admitted I stayed because I thought I could not survive without him. But watching you survive, Clara, watching you fight it, gave me courage. Slowly, she separated her finances, filed for divorce, and began to rediscover the woman she had once been. I saw glimpses of the mother I remembered from Worcester, the woman who used to braid my hair and cheer at my spelling bees. It was as if a veil lifted, revealing the person Harold had nearly erased. My acceptance into Boston University's pre-law program became another milestone. On the first day of orientation, I walked across the campus, the red brick buildings glowing in autumn sunlight, and felt a surge of belonging. I was not the girl hiding bruises anymore. I was a young woman with purpose. Professors spoke about constitutional law, civil rights advocacy. Every word felt like a key unlocking the path I had long dreamed of. In one seminar, I was asked to share why I had chosen law. My voice wavered but held, because I know what it feels like to be silenced, and I know how powerful it is when someone finally listens. The room grew quiet, and I saw Nod's eyes shining. My pain was not only mine anymore. It was a bridge to others who understood. Opportunities blossomed. One evening, I received an invitation to give a TEDx talk in Boston. At first, I hesitated. Standing on stage again, recalling what had happened at graduation, terrified me. But Sophie squeezed my hand. You need to do this, Clara. Not just for you. For everyone who needs to hear. The night of the event, the auditorium lights were blinding. I stepped onto the stage, my palms damp, my heart hammering. I took a breath and began. My talk was titled, Justice is Louder Than Family Abuse. I spoke about Worcester, about Harold and David, about the night I bled on stage and thought my life was over. I spoke about truth, about resilience, about turning restitution into refuge. As I finished, the audience rose to their feet. The applause washed over me like a tide. Later that evening, I checked my phone. The video was already online, already spreading. Comments poured in from people across the country, some thanking me, some sharing their own scars. For once, I felt not alone, but part of something vast and human. Amid this rise, there were quiet nights of doubt. Sometimes a comment on social media would cut deep. Sometimes I woke sweating from dreams of David's fist, of Harold's silence. Healing was not a straight line, but therapy helped, writing helped, and above all, Sophie's presence helped. She was my anchor, reminding me that the girl in the gown had not been destroyed, she had been reborn. My journey was not only about public revenge, it was about private rebuilding, about forgiving myself for years of silence, about accepting that I could not change Harold or David, but I could change myself. During one therapy session, Dr. Martinez said something that lingered. Forgiveness is not about excusing them, it is about releasing yourself from their grip. And slowly I did. My relationship with my mother grew steadier. We shared dinners in her small apartment, nights watching old movies, mornings drinking coffee together. She told me stories of my father's stories Harold had tried to erase, stories that made me feel connected to a man I had lost too soon. For the first time in years, our bond felt real again. Publicly, I became a symbol, though I never asked for it. Survivors wrote to me. Schools invited me to speak. Each time I told my story, I felt a piece of the shame dissolve. Each time I saw a young girl's eyes light up with recognition, I knew the cycle was breaking. The climax of this chapter came when I stood once more at Agganis Arena, not as a student in a gown, but as a guest speaker for Boston University's freshman convocation. The same stage where David had struck me now held me as I spoke words of encouragement to thousands of incoming students. I told them, your worth is not measured by the cruelty of others. You are more than their insults, more than their fists. You are your own future. The applause was thunderous. Tears stung my eyes as I stepped away, knowing I had rewritten the memory of that stage forever. The irony was not lost on me. The place of my greatest humiliation had become the place of my greatest empowerment. By the time my first year ended, the narrative of Clara Mitchell had shifted entirely. I was no longer only the girl with the broken nose. I was a student, a speaker, a survivor, a symbol. And though scars remained both visible and hidden, I carried them not as weights, but as reminders of resilience. Resolution did not mean forgetting. It meant choosing what defined me. Healing did not mean the absence of pain. It meant the presence of purpose. And purpose, I discovered, was stronger than any wound. 2 years after the night David shattered my nose on stage, the story of my family had become something different entirely. I was 20 now, standing outside Harvard Law School, clutching an acceptance letter that felt heavier than the paper it was printed on. Boston University had been the bridge, but Harvard was the mountain, and I had climbed it. My hands trembled as I stared at the red crest at the top of the page. Somewhere deep inside me, the girl who once cried into her pillow in Worcester whispered, "You did it." Life in Massachusetts had changed in ways I could never have predicted. Harold Mitchell, once untouchable, was now the centerpiece of a sprawling investigation led by the Attorney General. I still remembered watching the live press conference where the Attorney General stood before a wall of microphones, reporters jostling for position. Documents were projected onto a screen, showing Harold's own emails instructing attorneys to silence witnesses and his signature on corporate settlements tied to David's misconduct. The Attorney General's voice was steady, cutting through the chaos. Harold Mitchell obstructed justice and misused corporate resources to conceal violence within his family. This office will not tolerate such abuse of power. The words spread across Boston that day like wildfire. Mitchell properties collapsed further in the weeks that followed. Investors fled. Banks froze accounts. Contracts were shredded. Community boards voted to sever ties. Once Harold's name had opened doors, now it slammed them shut. By the time bankruptcy was finalized, the company was a shell, and Harold himself faced multiple counts of obstruction. The Boston Globe ran headline after headline, each one another nail in the coffin of his reputation. My mother Linda showed me one article over breakfast one morning. She had finally moved into her own apartment, modest but filled with plants and sunlight. She traced the words with her finger. "He is finally paying for everything, Clara." I nodded. Not just paying Mom. Being stripped of everything he thought made him untouchable. David, meanwhile, had drifted further into obscurity. The viral video of him begging for money still resurfaced occasionally, each time reigniting mockery. He struggled to hold a job. The label Parasite turned back on him in every interview and whispered behind his back in every neighborhood. He was living proof of consequence. He had tried to bury me in shame, and instead, the world had buried him. But my life was no longer about Harold or David. It was about what I built in the aftermath. At Harvard, I poured myself into classes, long nights in the library, heated debates and seminars. The law was no longer abstract. It was personal, alive in every statute and precedent. I joined a student group focused on advocacy for survivors of domestic violence. Together, we held workshops, wrote op-eds, and lobbied for stronger protections in Massachusetts. My story gave me credibility, but it was their stories that fueled me. I listened to women from Dorchester, Roxbury, Worcester, each one carrying scars like mine. We were no longer silent. We were building something together. In my second year, I launched the Clara Mitchell Foundation with Sophie's help. What started as a small scholarship for high school girls who had experienced family violence grew quickly. Donations poured in from across the country, some as small as $10, others as large as corporate grants. The mission was simple but powerful: to provide resources and mentorship for young women who wanted to pursue education despite toxic homes. I still remember the first scholarship ceremony. 10 girls stood on a stage in Cambridge, their faces shining with pride. One clutched her violin case, another spoke of studying engineering, another whispered that she wanted to be a lawyer like me. As I handed out the awards, I thought of the notebook I once hid under my mattress, the bruises I documented in secret the nights I thought no one would ever believe me. And now, here I was believing in them. Closure did not come in a single dramatic moment. It came in quiet mornings walking across Harvard Yard, in evenings cooking dinner with my mother, in laughter with Sophie as we planned the foundation's next steps. It came in realizing that my identity was no longer tied to Harold's cruelty or David's violence, but to my own resilience and the future I was shaping. Yet there were moments when the past brushed against the present. Once leaving class, I saw Harold on the steps of the Suffolk County Courthouse surrounded by reporters. His hair had gone white, his posture stooped. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Our eyes met across the distance, and for the first time there was no intimidation in his gaze, only weariness. He did not approach me, and I did not approach him. That silence was closure enough. Another time I received a letter from David, rambling and incoherent, asking for forgiveness. I read it once and then fed it into the shredder. Forgiveness, I had learned, was not something owed. It was something chosen, and I chose to forgive myself, not them. The ultimate closure came in an unexpected place. One rainy afternoon, I found myself back at Aganis Arena, invited to speak at a conference on resilience and leadership. As I walked onto the stage, memories flooded me, the blood on my gown, the jeers, the collapse. But now the lights shone on me as a speaker, not a victim. I told the audience about the moment David's fist broke more than my nose, how it broke the silence that had bound me. I told them about the Attorney General's investigation, about Harold's downfall, about the foundation that now bore my name. I ended with this: family may break your bones, but it can never break your destiny. The applause thundered through the arena, a sound that replaced the echo of humiliation with the roar of triumph. Afterward, a young girl approached me, tears in her eyes. "My stepbrother hurt me too," she whispered. "Hearing you makes me feel like maybe I can heal." I hugged her tightly. "You can," I said. "You already have started." That was the legacy. Not just my own healing, but the ripple effect. The knowledge that every time I spoke, another person might find courage. As I placed a framed photograph on my office desk at Harvard, an old picture of my mother and me at the beach, hair wild in the wind, both of us laughing, I felt the final piece slide into place. This was who I was. Not Harold's stepdaughter, not David's victim. Clara Mitchell, student advocate, survivor, builder of futures. Life would never be free of scars, but scars are proof of survival, and survival is the foundation of legacy.